call this regular meeting of Council of the Municipality of Jasper to order for January 5th, 2021, and welcome all of you and those who will be watching later on our YouTube channel. Welcome to 2021. In the words of John Lennon, let's hope it's a good one without any fear. But we're all set to move forward, and we have all of the optimism we need to get us started on what's going to continue to be a challenging year for a few months, but hopefully is going to get better as we progress. For today, I welcome everyone attending, those who are watching, and as I say, those who will watch later, but I particularly want to welcome Mr. Bill Given as our new CAO. Welcome on behalf of council and on behalf of municipal staff, and indeed on behalf of the entire community, not only to your role as CAO, but to becoming, I expect, the newest resident of our community. We're all very happy to have you here and wish you all the best as we move forward into this new year. So thank you, Bill. And with that, I am going to turn to approval of the agenda and make a suggestion that we advance item 8.1 on our agenda to perhaps 4.1 and drop 4.1 to 4.2 so that we can all have an opportunity early in the meeting to deal with the formal business of appointing Mr. Given and make him part of the meeting in a proper sense, and that will also give other councillors an opportunity to speak and express their welcomes to Mr. Given. So I'm open, of course, to any other suggestions for additions, deletions, or changes to the agenda, but I would invite any member of council to perhaps propose that we make that change in order of our agenda. Councillor McGrath?
I can move that, Mayor Ireland.
Thank you. Are there any other changes to be made to the agenda for today's meeting? Seeing none, then I have a motion from Councillor McGrath that agenda item 8.1 be advanced to become 4.1, and that what was 4.1 move down the list to 4.2. There's no discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor? There are none opposed. That is carried, and may have a motion then to approve the agenda as amended. Councillor Keller-Harempy, thank you. All in favor? There are none opposed. That is carried. We have our first agenda for the year. The minutes of the meeting of December 15th have been circulated. Are there any errors, omissions, or corrections required to be made to those minutes? Hearing none, may I have a motion, please, to approve the minutes of the meeting of December 15th, 2020 as presented? Councillor Butler, thank you. All in favor? There are none opposed. That is carried. So that then takes us to what used to be 8.1, which is now 4.1, and that is the more formal appointment of Mr. Given as CAO for the municipality of Jasper. You will recall, and it's in the background material, that when we first agreed to appoint Mr. Given, he had not yet broken the news to the residents and council in Grand Prairie that he was going to accept the position. So we withheld his name temporarily. And just to make sure that it is formalized, the proposal today is to, by name Mr. Given as the Chief Administrative Officer for the municipality of Jasper. Is there anyone in administration who wishes to speak at all to the request for decision? I expected not. So councillors, Mr. Greathead has hand up.
Your Worship, I've been given the chance to have a few talks and discussions with Bill, and I believe that we're going to be in good hands going forward here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Greathead. Appreciated. Councillors? Councillor McGrath.
Well, I would love to start the morning by welcoming Mr. Given and his family to the community of Jasper. We're delighted to have you as part of our team and part of our community. You are a proven and dedicated leader, Bill, and a man who I am so confident will steer our community and the organization in the most optimistic direction possible. So I'm so entirely grateful for your presence and for you to be here in Jasper and to be part of our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Journeau.
I thank you. Congratulations, Bill or Mr. Given. When everybody says may 2021 be better than 2020, the addition of Mr. Given to our council will make it better. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Journeau. We still need a motion if someone is prepared to make a motion. Councillor Butler, thank you. You may need to unmute, Mr. Yes, Councillor Butler, I recognize you.
Sorry, minor technical glitch. Yes, I'm happy to make the motion. I also wanted to speak for a moment, and I wanted to take the opportunity to speak about the process that council went through in selecting Mr. Given to this position. It was an exhaustive process. It started with nearly 100 applicants. We shortlisted several times, conducted many interviews. I am personally very pleased not only with the outcome of the process, which I certainly am, as I think Mr. Given will lead our community very ably, but I also was very satisfied and happy with the process that council went through to get itself to where it is today. And I think the community should feel well served in all respects by the decision that was made. And will cheerfully make that motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. If I can just find the correct wording then, it should be simple, that the motion is then before us that council appoint Bill Given to the position of Chief Administrative Officer for the municipality of Jasper. I'll call the question. All in favor? There are none opposed. That will in all respects be recorded as a unanimous vote, and well, it should be. And I echo all of the comments as Councillor Butler indicated. It was a bit of a churn, but with all churns, the cream rose to the top, and we are well rewarded. So we thank you, Mr. Given, for your application and credit you for success, and it will serve the community well. I think it's appropriate. I see you, Mr. Given, and I will turn to you in a second, but I think it's appropriate at this time too, though, that as we welcome Mr. Given, we acknowledge and respect the service that we had from Mr. Greathead. And it was exceptional. And Mr. Greathead, thank you so much for accepting our offer to step in and assume the role of interim CAO. I know that in your humble and modest manner, you will credit others in the organization for your success. But on behalf of council, I do want to acknowledge that you met and exceeded our expectations. You held the ship together in a remarkable stormy seas in exemplary fashion, and we thank you for that. And I know that you were able to rely on the assistance and support of all of our staff, but most particularly, I expect Mrs. Malinchuk, Mr. Van Tegum, Miss Fleming, I think Miss Nadon, and certainly other members of the operations department, including Mr. Hutton and Mr. Bolduc. And all of those showed exemplary support to you, and we thank them. And I think to Mr. Given, we can suggest that that level of support, with the addition of the wonderful support of Mr. Greathead, is all now available to you. So thank you, John and crew, for getting us through the last couple of months. And Mr. Given, welcome to you, and know that you have an appreciative council and a very supportive administrative staff at your back. And with that, Mr. Given, I saw your hand up earlier, so I turn it to you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Your Worship. I'll be very brief. I want to thank Council for the opportunity to serve and for the invitation and privilege of joining you as a Jasperite. I'm looking forward to my family joining me later on this spring, but my thanks to Council for the selection, and I am committed to obviously working to ensure that your direction is implemented because I know that you have the interests of the community at heart. And I want to thank the members of administration as well. The welcome that I've received at this early stage has been exemplary. I am so pleased to be joining a high-functioning team with Jasper administration, and so I'm really pleased with the welcome that I've received, and thankful that I have such a great and supportive team in place already, and I'm looking forward to getting going.
Thank you. Great to have you here again. All right, let's continue then with the agenda, and that takes us to item 4.2 as it now is, Emergency Coordination Committee update. And I would have expected perhaps, well, I see Mr. Hutton has his microphone off, so I'm going to expect that it's Mr. Hutton who will be speaking to this matter.
Yes, good morning, Mayor and Council. Welcome, Bill. I look forward to meeting you in person, but I understand that Zoom's probably the way to go in the immediate future. Yeah, so a quick ECC update. Although our ECC team did not meet formally over the past 2 weeks, we did monitor the situation, both locally and across the province and Canada. And I think I'll piggyback on Mayor Ireland's comments that there is some optimism out there, and I will speak to that. Although we still see some staggering numbers across the country, it does appear that in many regions, the active cases are trending down. In Canada, as of yesterday, we had over 600,000 total cases. Alberta topped out at over 105,000. Sorry, not active cases, total cases, and Jasper was sitting at 181. But in that encouraging trend, we are down to 9 active cases in Jasper, which is well below where we were 2 weeks ago, which shows a trend locally. And I would like to take this moment to thank those that have made their efforts to adhere not just to the provincial guidelines, but to the recommendations as well to help us bring that case count down in Jasper. We did unfortunately over the past 2 weeks experience 1 additional death. Locally, I don't have any additional information on that, but sad to note one further one, taking us to a total of 5. I'd also like to highlight a lot of media focus on those that have not adhered to the guidelines and regulations, and would like to encourage residents and visitors to focus on those that are adhering, not the minority that are not. My experience over the Christmas holidays was those that were out and I encountered were respectful of distance, respectful of masking, and very willing to comply with what our town is asking them. It's not a time to let our efforts down, though. We are still a town, a resort town that has seen visitors come to travel and ski and experience our wonderful settings. We do see a couple reports of variants in the COVID virus coming out in different locations around the world. We're hoping that this does not play significantly, but it is also something we're monitoring. And with that, I think that's about my update for this past couple of weeks, and hopefully we see a continued trend locally and across the country for cases trending downward.
Thank you for that, Mr. Hutton. Are there any questions of Mr. Hutton from councillors? Councillor Journeau.
Not a question, but a comment. Just pleased to note that as of 3 days ago, I think it was the second, vaccination has commenced in Jasper, and I think just over 100 people have been vaccinated for the first time. So that's a good start.
Thank you, Councillor Journeau. Anything else? All right, we will thank you again, Mr. Hutton, for that report. Thank the ECC for its continued efforts on behalf of the community. It's all appreciated. And thank you for today. Agenda item 5, business arising. Is there any business arising from the minutes of December 15th? If not, we can move to agenda item 6, department reports. There are none scheduled. Mr. Given, there is nothing to add to that.
Not today.
Thank you. Bylaws, then we have as agenda item 17.1, just a bylaw summary, and 17.2. We have for third reading today, the bylaw number 2, amending the temporary compulsory face covering bylaw. That bylaw received first and second reading, I think early December. We deferred third reading at our last meeting because all was covered by provincial regulation in any respect, but we have it back for consideration now. And it's an interesting situation. We don't know yet what the province will do at the end of the current regulatory regime. With the numbers that Mr. Hutton just presented to us in the ECC report, I think we would now be below enhanced status if we were to return to that, in which case the proposed amendment to the bylaw would not be effective. We worded it such that the enhanced measures in our amended bylaw will be effective only in periods of enhanced classification under provincial legislation. So that's where we stand now. But I leave it open. Is there an intent by administration to speak at all to the proposed third reading before we get to it?
I don't believe so, Your Worship. Obviously, as you stated, the provincial regulations, would take precedence. If council wished to move forward with third reading, obviously that wouldn't have an impact on how things are operating in Jasper today. But it would ensure that if Jasper remained in enhanced status, but there was some change announced by the province, and I believe they had identified January 12th as the point at which they would re-examine their current public health orders. Approval of third reading would ensure that the bylaw was ready and activated should those provincial regulations change at that time.
Yes, thank you for that. Councillors, any comments, suggestions with respect to the bylaw, or might I have a motion from anyone that council give third reading to the bylaw? And I do want to acknowledge that we have had certification from Parks Canada, and it was received at a very early date. We could have dealt with this earlier and chose not to, but I want to extend thanks to Parks Canada for their timeliness and responsiveness in getting certification. And it was only the advent of further provincial regulations that prevented us from passing this bylaw by third reading some number of weeks ago, but that's thanks to Parks Canada. So councillors, anyone interested in making a motion that we give third reading to bylaw number, I think it's 231? Councillor Keller-Harampy.
Even though we don't need it now, we're not enhanced, but we may need it in the future if the numbers climb again and if the provincial guidelines change. So it's temporary. I don't think there's any harm in passing this today and having it on the back burner should we need to use it. Otherwise, we're going to have to start the whole process over again and it'll be too late to use it then. So I'm quite happy to make a motion to pass the third reading of bylaw number 231.
Thank you, Councillor Keller-Harampy. So we have a motion to give third reading to bylaw number 231, bylaw to amend the Jasper temporary compulsory face covering bylaw number 228 for a second time. Any further discussion, comments? Councillor McGrath.
I'm wondering if anyone from administration might be able to confirm with my research on this proposed bylaw and the provincial bylaw or the provincial mandate sitting next to each other. The one differentiating factor that I could notice was that in the provincial law, it states that a barrier acts as a sufficient shield between, say, a retail environment, and that a face covering didn't need to be worn behind the barrier. But our local bylaw states that even if a barrier is in place, a mask must be worn behind it. So that might change some culture in the community and some, say, retail culture of what you're standing behind. And am I correct in my assumption that that is the one major difference between what we are proposing and what the province has enacted?
Your worship, at this stage, I would refer that question to, I think likely Ms. Nadon, Christine, if she'd be able to speak to that. But certainly that provincial regulation allowing for a protective barrier to stand in place is quite common in another of other communities. And the provinces has chosen that as acceptable. Council could choose to amend the bylaw or postpone or pass the bylaw as is. But I think Councillor McGrath, you're correct in that reading.
Thank you, Mr. Given, and your worship, through to Councillor McGrath. That is accurate. The explanation you just provided around the difference between the two is reflective of what's in place. And the reason for that was that we had some from our medical experts locally had received some information that transmission had occurred even though there was a physical barrier, and that's why that clause was included in the bylaw. But as explained by Mr. Given, that could change subject to council's will.
Thank you, Mr. Don. I will return to you, Councillor McGrath. It was in, well, I will go to you now. I did see Councillor Wilson, but that was in response to your question. So I'll return to you, Councillor McGrath.
I'd just like to thank administration for that confirmation. I myself work on the front lines and I appreciate both my barrier in place and wearing my mask. And I'm really appreciative specifically of the ECC being connected with the physicians who are doing the contact tracing. So I'm finding out this information that I probably should be wearing eyewear as well. And the information that we're finding out because our physicians are so involved locally with our contact tracing is remarkable. And I am certainly in favor of more protective measures as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I was just going to put my support behind Councillor Keller MP. I think that we should pass the bylaw as it is today, have it in our back pocket. And as it is temporary, we can always revoke it quite quickly. But we worked hard on this one, and I think it should stand as is, and yeah, just have it available when and if needed.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Any other comments? Well, before I call the question then, I will speak to it, and I too support putting this in place. It is subject to application only when we are in enhanced status, which is the case today, but may not be the case later. And I acknowledge the point raised by Councillor McGrath that it is different than the provincial regulation in terms of barriers, and that is, as Mr. Don indicated, it's a workplace issue that changed this, and the evidence seems to be that a worker in an environment with a 12-foot ceiling and a 2-foot piece of glass in front of them is not protected in a real sense. They're protected, I suppose, as the Prime Minister once said, from moist speaking, but they're not necessarily protected from the air. And so our bylaw goes a bit further than the provincial regulation, but that was on the advice of the ECC and local doctors who wish to protect workers in our community, and I certainly support that. So despite the change from the provincial regulatory regime, I am in favor of passing the motion now with the bylaw, the amending bylaw, as it is. Councillor Butler?
Thank you. And I agree with everything that's been raised, but I am confused because while we've been discussing this, I'm looking at Municipality of Jasper bylaw number 2228. And the wording there does contain the clause, unless the person is separated from other persons in the indoor public space by a physical barrier, and so on. So to me, our bylaw does contain an exemption, and I don't see where we removed that exemption in the subsequent. This would be our second amendment. The first amendment, as far as I can see, didn't remove that. So am I misunderstanding?
I can turn that, of course, to administration, but my understanding is that the change is in the definition of indoor workplace in the amending bylaw, which is before us, which you are correct that in the initial bylaw, in an indoor public place, barriers are permitted, but in the definition of indoor workplace, we have deleted reference to barriers. So the difference could be in the way the public is required to behave in an indoor place as opposed to workers in an indoor workplace.
That clarifies it for me. Thank you very much.
Any further comment with respect to the motion then before us, which is to give third reading to bylaw number 231? I see no other hands, so I will call the question that council give third reading to bylaw number 231, a bylaw to amend bylaw number 228 for a second time. All in favor? There are none opposed. That is carried. Thank you all for that. And that takes us to agenda item 7.3, utility fee levy and collection bylaw number 2021. All three readings are requested at today's meeting, and we are in the unprecedented position of having received certification from Parks Canada prior to having given second or even first reading to this particular bylaw. So again, credit and thanks to Parks Canada for being so responsive to our needs as we are in this situation where we wanted to be able to get to third reading at today's meeting so that the the new fees could be in place for this billing cycle. Councillor McGrath, did I see your hand? I did not. All right, so is there anything from administration, firstly, before I call for first reading of bylaw number 232?
Your worship, I'll obviously Ms. Melnichuk will speak to the details of the bylaw, but I believe administration would suggest that this conforms to the direction given by council. As you can see, the overall net increase to revenue equals 176,176 over the 2020 levy amount. This amount is required as a result of a number of cost increases in utilities. Council is well aware of the additional debenture borrowing. There were some increases in a number of the different sub items in the utilities, which I believe council is aware of. And this is administration's proposal in response to the direction from council previously. Also, as I think council understands, there is some urgency to moving forward with the utility rate bylaw so that that's complete as we move into the new year. But I would leave any other technical questions at this time to Ms. Melnichuk.
Councillor Demota.
Thank you very much, and through you to Ms. Melnichuk or Mr. Greathead. Just the question on the background update and the actual numbers when it comes to looking at the increases and decreases columns in either residential or commercial. Just to get an idea of how, let's say, the amounts of water and garbage, for an example, although indicated in the background that garbage would have a 5% increase, that it actually shows a decrease in dollar amount as per the cubic meters of volume that were indicated.
Councillor Demota, through your worship, as I indicated in the background update, council directed a 3.5% in water and sewer and 5% to garbage and recycling, resulting overall in a 3.94% increase to all the levies. Being that sewer as a sub-department required the most additional support, the budget had to be reworked to make the 176,000 work with the debenture and whatnot. So that is the reason that you see those figures and the changes within them. It was a challenge to work with 1/10 of what was recommended by administration. The 3.5 and 5% collectively works out to that 3.94, and that's what I had to do to make those budgets work, so that the expense, especially within the sanitation sub-department, would work out for the upcoming year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
I just like to express that I won't be supporting this bylaw if it goes forward. I do support a quite a bit larger increase, especially as we directed administration in the past. I feel that all of a sudden we've got cold feet, but knowingly we have 4 large commercial developments happening this year. Our already taxed water and sewer services will inevitably start to fail, and already are starting to fail. Unfortunately, this doesn't look good. It's not the year, but it is needed. A 3% is a token increase to assist in servicing four, if not 5 large commercial developments, and we need to start planning for that. And I would, it should just, might as well be zero. Like, unfortunately, we have to step up. I would increase this back to the $750,000 increase that we supported originally.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Demota?
I completely understand where Councillor Wilson's coming from, and he does have some valid points. But unfortunately, I think for myself, it's not the right year to do that. And I think maybe next year would probably be a better time to examine once, you know, those entities are on board. My concern is right now, just having some conversations with some of the local stakeholders, is that even though we had a decrease in visitation and some operations were operating at a much lower capacity, for some of the larger commercial operators, as in like restaurants and hotels, to keep their operations going, there is a continued consumption. And you know, some have maybe said that their operations have dropped, or their revenues dropped by 50%. It's still taking a lot to keep those operations going, and particularly in areas such as compressors and things like dishwashers and things that still need to continue running. A lot of consumption through some of the commercial businesses, like hotels and restaurants. There are a lot of water-cooled compressors and machinery like that that need to continually run. So there is that level of consumption, and to hit an already taxed industry with a greater increase, other than some of the costs, and just even seeing that, although quite small in some areas, the sewer aspect of the increase is going to be an increased amount. So this is an area where I think we need to tread lightly with, and consider those businesses that still need to keep operating. And even though they do have a kind of lower volume as far as revenue and visitation goes, their operations are still continuing at an increased cost. Well, it's not as high, but it's still high. Like some areas are still reporting that with their lack of, or their lower visitation numbers, they still are seeing only about a 20%, 25% drop in what their operational costs are for water and sewer. So I think that having those considerations in mind, I'm in favor of moving with a small incremental increase this year. Sorry for the ramble.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. Councillor Keller-Hantby, and then Councillor McGrath.
I too am in favor of this bylaw. I totally understand. Going forward this year, we really have to put a plan in place. We heard clearly from our business community early in December that they really needed our help this year. They're willing to work with us. They know our infrastructure is failing. They have said themselves they're willing to meet with council, work with administration to put something in place for the future, but they cannot afford it this year. There's many small businesses in town that are actually more affected than some of our big players. They're down 80 to 85%. They just cannot afford the increases this year. So therefore, I'm in favor of this bylaw. And as I stated back in December, council has a lot of work to do in the next 6 months to put something in place. We may even pass an increase later in the year as we see what happens with the fallout from COVID. But I do support this bylaw.
Councillor McGrath.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. We certainly need to reach a point and plan for future years to achieve a more stable and sustainable utilities department. But I am certain that this is not the year to do so, that this increment is what's appropriate and what is right for this year. The developments in Jasper Councillor Wilson speaks to also points to a vulnerability in the planning and development jurisdiction, not being connected enough to our operations and the large scale of work that this council and administration has ahead of us that we vastly need to improve.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Wilson, followed by Councillor Juneau.
Not to harp on it, but I think at some point, if we're going to allow development, we have to support development. And if we're not supporting development, there has to be a point where, say, the municipality steps up and says, we're not moving forward with our housing project. Our services, our utilities can't support it. Maybe there's some point where the municipality has to say, you know, Pursuit, this isn't the year. We can't support adding your building tying it into this to the existing service. We can't support it. RCMP, not this year. Unfortunately, we can't do it. GA, GB, sorry, I already mentioned one of those. Not this year, but we can't. Development adds, commercial development adds taxpayers, and that gives us more ability to tax in the future. We have to support that. It's just backwards to say that yeah, go ahead and develop these properties. We're not going to support this the infrastructure, but we're gonna want to tax you when you're completed. We have to support the development as well as be ready to tax them when it's completed. So anyway, I think it sounds like I'm out to lunch on this one, but I don't feel so.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Juneau.
Thank you. I acknowledge Councillor Wilson's concern. But what I saw in the budget is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was always in the understanding that the water sewer utilities budget was a separate budget than the overall budget. In other words, all the money stays within the budget. There was no crossovers. And what I saw here was the extra 700-some thousand being put into the general revenue of the operating budget instead of being set aside for reserves for exactly what Councillor Wilson is talking about. Now, I would have supported it for that reason, but I couldn't support it if the money is just going to go into general revenue for the operating budget. So that concerns me, and I think that that's something that we have to really be clear on in the future, is that the utilities budget stands on its own and that there's no crossovers. I will support this motion for that reason.
Your worship, if I may speak to that.
Yes.
There has been no crossover between the utility and the operating budget. So every other department is separated out to be finance and administration, CFS, productive services, culture and recreation, as well as operations. Operations then is separated into utilities. There's a tax portion and a utility portion. Whatever is being collected within utilities is staying within utilities, and there has not been any transfer over to the operating budget at all for the tax requisition.
Thank you, Mr. Melnichuk. Councillor Demota.
Well, I wanted to say to Councillor Wilson that he's not out to lunch on this, and I totally understand where he's coming from again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but you know, if and when these new developments come online, we will be getting some revenue for the consumption and or the waste that are occurring in those sectors, so or those areas. So although I understand where he's coming from, by the time these developments get on board, might be later in the year. And I think that you know, the upcoming years will be the time to make it up once those businesses or developments are on board. So I think that whatever comes on this year, we'll still be able to get some revenue out of whatever is being consumed in those areas. So completely understand where he's coming from. You're not out to lunch. I completely get where you're coming from. Like other councillors have said, I don't think this is the year to have some large increases.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wilson's comments are well taken, and to a point, he's completely correct. There's absolutely no doubt that we have to direct more. We have to find more revenue, and we have to direct it toward our in-ground infrastructure. But part of the conversation that we simply haven't had enough time to pursue is the question of where that money comes from, how we raise it. Since the day I was elected to council, we have had conversations about the need to overhaul our billing system. And we have waited and waited to have that conversation. And unfortunately, the way in which it came about was honestly can be characterized as a little bit too much and too late. We need to find more money for our infrastructure system, but the question for me is where it comes from and how we raise it. And I might have been comfortable with a somewhat higher increase even for this year if I could see that it was raised in a more equitable way, but I was particularly uncomfortable with the heavily consumption-based way in which it was, we were looking at it. And we just didn't have time to have that conversation in the couple of months that passed since that point, and the current circumstances with COVID being the pressing issue that it is. To Councillor Wilson's point about new developments, normally, and in this community as well, revenue for new developments, commercial or residential, is handled through offsite levies. And we have an offsite levy bylaw, which also needs to be considered as part and parcel of how we raise money for our in-ground infrastructure. We also are operating under some sort of a fundamental understanding that I'm not sure how we arrived at, that the revenue raised in each sub-department would only go toward that sub-department. So for that reason, while we asked for a 3.5% increase in sewer fees along with increases in other areas, we are actually not being presented with that. We're being presented with an 11% increase in sewer and no increase or even some decreases in the other, which is not what we asked for and not what we said. And it's because, as I understand it, that there's an understanding that the revenue raised in each sub-department will be used only within that sub-department. That is a good idea on the surface, but I'm not sure it's one that's sustainable. I think that the goal of funding our utilities system entirely through utilities billings is a goal that we're not going to be able to follow. Our in-ground infrastructure needs to be supported through the tax requisition as well. And that, to my thinking, is part of the conversation here. So I'm completely aware that we need to raise more money, much more money, to manage our infrastructure system. But we're 20 years behind in this conversation, and we weren't going to fix it in 30 days. So unfortunately, we're left with the reality of a small incremental increase for this year. And then I think we need to task ourselves seriously with having the conversations that need to be had, taking the time that needs to be taken to have those conversations in the next few months and move ourselves significantly down the road to a properly funded utility system. But the goal that we set for ourselves to have that conversation in, a few weeks in the midst of COVID was just not tenable. So while I'm not happy to be doing what we're doing, we need a bylaw. I don't like that we directed 3.5% and got across the board and 5% in some areas and got 11% in sewer and no increase in the other areas, but it's close enough to what we talked about that I'm prepared to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. For my part, although I share the views expressed by Councillor Wilson, and in fact, initially would have been prepared to go even further and supported the tiering that was proposed. I understand where council has arrived. My concern with not supporting the bylaw as it is now presented is the position in which we will leave administration. At our request, administration prepared initially a bylaw that dealt with consumption rates, an increased base rate, connection fee based on meter size and a tiering rate. And they did that at the direction of council, and council then, I think can fairly be said to have changed its mind and directed administration to come back with another bylaw. If this bylaw is not passed, what sort of a bylaw are we going to expect from administration, and what effort will have to be put into that? The second matter is we need something in order to move forward with the budget. Without an understanding of where we go on utilities, administration is in the untenable position where they can't come back to us, say next month, with a budget at all. So although I think this is way too little, way too late, I am comforted by the fact that council quite clearly articulated a desire to get on with an entire rework of the utility rate bylaw as a priority item in the next couple of months. And perhaps, as Councillor Kelleher MP indicated, we might achieve that in time to change fees even this year. And yes, businesses are suffering, and we have heard that they cannot afford an increase, but the real question is, someone has to pay for this stuff, and it's going to be either utility users or it's going to be taxpayers. So I think the cost is there anyway. And so my question on all of this, Mr. Given, to you and through you, presumably to Mrs. Malinchuk, if this bylaw is passed in its present form, 3 readings today as presented, what in very general terms is likely to be the impact on the operational budget?
Well, I'll answer first, Your Worship, in the general, and then go to Ms. Malinchuk for the detail. But the passage of this bylaw, while it does not meet the initial recommendation from administration, it does respond to the direction from council. It would provide certainty for administration to allow administration to move forward with the development of a budget. We may or may not be able to address the infrastructure challenges that have been raised and are, as noted by Councillor Wilson, very real. It's great to hear that all of council is well aware of those infrastructure challenges, and administration will keep that in mind as we develop the budget this year and over coming years, because it certainly isn't a deficit that will be addressed in a single year, as noted by many around the table. But I will say that the passage of the bylaw today at least establishes certainty for administration so that we can move forward. I think that is a step forward, and while it may not meet the intent of some members of council in terms of tackling that infrastructure deficit, establishing certainty for today is preferable to uncertainty over a sustained period. I would turn it to Ms. Malinchuk if she had any other specifics around the development timelines of the budget or the impact of this on the 2021 property tax supported budget. Ms. Malinchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Well said. I think you summarized quite well what I was going to say anyway. We will have to look at what we can do capital-wise going forward, given that it the numbers don't reflect what we were looking at initially. And for the 2021 budget going forward, it gives us the ability to advertise to the users within the next utility bills of the changes that will be reflected within the next year. And that is appreciated by administration as well as by I'm sure all the users going ahead, that they have a few months notice of what the changes will be. And but yes, overall operating wise, it will be a bit of a challenge, but we were faced with a challenge this year, so we will just have to work with this, and we will be assessing our capital and before coming back to council again to discuss what we can do with what's given to us this year.
Thank you, Mrs. Melnichuk. Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Demota?
Well, I'd like to thank administration for the extra work that was asked by them. And, you know, we're in some difficult times and things might seem to be appearing to change on the fly and might continue to do so going down the road. It could be in the other direction. You know, when we're looking at these estimated changes and things like that, like one thing to consider and to maybe get some clarification on the justification for the individual sub departments, as in, let's, for an example, water and sewer. Although some may consider those to be combined at times, when you look at the differences in the commercial sector, so let's look at a business that might use 10,000 cubic meters just to make the number simple. We're looking at a $2,400 swing in sewer costs, in sewage costs, and only a $50 decrease in water. And so if someone's actually being conservative about, you know, their water usage, they're still going to be dinged on the other end as the water goes out to the treatment plant. So there is some justification for that. We need to be clear on the delivery of the reasoning behind those numbers. So I'm assuming it's because of the increased costs for running our sewage treatment plant.
Your worship, through to Councillor Demota, if I may.
Yes.
Yes, so as you can see, going forward, the wastewater treatment plant is quite an expense overall. The sewage expenses are increasing more and more. It's something that definitely costs more in the end with what has to be done with the sewage. I know that Mr. Greathead might be able to speak more to the differences between water and sewer, but sewer is definitely something that costs the municipality a lot more.
Thank you for that. Mr. Greathead, go ahead.
Your worship, after the Walkerton incident, it changed a lot of things within the utilities world. And part of the problems that caused and were an issue for Walkerton was there was a lack of operator training significantly, but also that the water system was not paying for itself. And it was being funded off of general tax dollars and that revenue. And as governments tried to, you know, reduce taxes and cut back in those days, what happened was the water was one of the first things to go. So I believe it was Justice O'Connor who conducted the inquiry, and they made numerous recommendations about the utilities and how to maintain the integrity of the utility systems. So each branch, you know, it should be funded on its own. There needs to be a business model for each section and segment of the water and wastewater streams. So our certification as operators, we have 4 disciplines we can choose, and most of our staff within the municipality who work in the utilities department have certification in all four. So there's water treatment, there's water distribution, wastewater collection, and wastewater treatment. So each of those, we got to be looking at it as an individual entity. It's its own thing. It needs to have its own funding. So while the numbers did not, and the preparation that Ms. Malinchuk had made does not follow the exact, for just as a phrase, is not following the letter of the law, it's following the spirit of the law. So we took council's recommendation in saying that council was comfortable with 3.5% and 5% for the water and wastewater sections, and then 5% for the solid waste and recycling. We had let council know that the revenue streams have changed within the recycling. The costs have been driven up, and same with the tipping fees for our solid waste at the regional landfill. So to make each one stand a little bit better on its own, this is why the numbers have come out the way Ms. Malinchuk has presented it. So we did take your direction, council's direction, and prepare these numbers. It just, the math, the way we have to work towards paying off the debentures and that, this is just where the allocations fall this year. But our intent was to work within the boundaries that council had dictated to us.
Thank you, Mr. Greathead. A great historical perspective and a legal perspective back to Walkerton. Thank you for that. I see no other hands, and I've lost track a little bit. Councillor Keller-Hranpe, you began the discussion, I think. Did you make a motion that we give this first reading? If you did, I didn't record it.
I did not, but I can make that motion.
All right, and the motion is that council give first reading to bylaw number 232, the utility rates and fees bylaw 2021, correct?
Correct.
All right, I have the motion then before you. I will call the question for first reading of bylaw number 232. Those in favor? Opposed? There is one opposed. So that bylaw has received first reading. Might I have a motion to read bylaw number 232 for a second time? Councillor Journeau, thank you. All in favor? Those opposed? There is one opposed. That is carried. Now, it seems to me, and I haven't had a chance to consult the procedural bylaw, but Mr. Given, through you to Ms. Nadon, is it required that we have a motion to give third reading at today's meeting, having given first and second reading and having already obtained certification? It's just a technical question about whether we need a motion to give third reading at today's meeting before I actually call the question.
Your worship, I would answer based on my past experience, but the procedure bylaws may be different. So I'll look to Ms. Nadon for an interpretation. I appreciate that this is somewhat unprecedented, that council has the opportunity to have all three readings at the same meeting. So I'll look to Ms. Nadon for the reference from the procedure bylaw.
Your worship, I'm not sure I understand the question.
The question is, do we need a specific motion to permit third reading at the same meeting as first and second meeting? It is a common provision, but whether it is our provision, I forgot to research last night this very question, but it did pop into my mind.
Give me a few seconds here. I can look it up, but I do not know the answer off the top of my head.
All right, you can relieve yourself of any further reading. I have found the provision. In Schedule 3, I think it is, of our procedural bylaw, item 19.8, council may not give a bylaw more than 2 readings at a meeting unless councillors unanimously agree to consider third reading at that meeting and Parks Canada certification has previously been obtained. So we do need a motion to give third reading at today's meeting. Otherwise, third reading will be at a subsequent meeting. Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. So I understand that what we need is, at this point, a motion to consider third reading prior to a motion to read for the third time. And if that is correct, I would so move.
Thank you, Councillor Butler.
Council, consider giving third reading at this meeting. I'm hoping that even though I understand there is opposition to providing that third meeting, that we will need unanimous consent to consider third reading. And so I'm hoping we can achieve that so that we can put this issue to rest today.
You're entirely correct on that. Mr. Given, I saw your hand up.
I was just going to say something similar. The motion to have third reading is essentially council giving its consent to moving forward with third reading. If there was anyone that was still in opposition to the bylaw, they could, of course, vote their conscience on third reading, as long as the motion to move forward to third reading passed unanimously. Otherwise, council wouldn't be able to pass the bylaw until the subsequent council meetings, as highlighted by Councillor Butler. So appreciate that there may be differing opinions about the bylaw itself, but the question in front of council on this motion would be, should council have third reading of the bylaw today or not? If not, then that third reading would occur at the next council meeting. From an administration perspective, again, I think the certainty established by dealing with the bylaw in one way or another is what administration would be looking for.
Thank you for that, Mr. Given. So I have the motion from Councillor Butler that council approve that there be a motion at today's meeting for third reading of bylaw number 232. If there's nothing further on that, I will call that question. All in favor? There are none opposed. That is carried. And then I need a motion to read bylaw number 232 for a third time. Councillor McGrath, thank you. No other hands up. I will call that question, and that is to give the bylaw a third reading. All in favor? Those opposed? There is one opposed. That is carried. So thank you all. Administration has a degree of certainty moving forward, and this is a critical point in the development of the overall budget. So that will come back to us when administration is able to put numbers together based on this and other factors that are under consideration. So thank you all. That takes us to agenda item 9. As we dealt with agenda item 8 earlier. We have no correspondence for information, consideration, or action presented on the agenda. I don't believe there is any. Is there anything that we need to consider under this agenda item? Mr. Given, through you to others? Apparently not. All right, thank you. Agenda item 10, other new business. Is there any other new business for council? Councillor Demota.
I apologize and I regret not addressing this earlier to add to the agenda for just discussion, but I'd like to congratulate the people that were behind the scenes and on the scenes for the December project, and including foremost Santa's Anonymous, and congratulating that group for achieving their and exceeding their goals for this year and going forward. And I just wanted to say that the involvement in the community spirit that I saw gained and maintained throughout December was quite substantial and really bonding for our community and for those that were participating. And you know, you fellow counselors, I found it very rewarding and motivating. So I think that many of us are happier and healthier because of that endeavor. So congratulations to everyone involved and to those who ran it.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. Is there any other new business? It has been brought to my attention during the course of the meeting that having appointed Mr. Given as CAO of the municipality of Jasper, we should perhaps also at this meeting appoint Mr. Given as CAO of the Jasper Community Housing Corporation so that there is not a gap. So our interim CAO, Mr. Greathead, was acting in that capacity during his tenure as interim CAO. But, and I leave this perhaps to Councillor Butler, if you wish, in your capacity as a representative on that. But if there is a need or at least a perception that we cover this base at today's meeting, I would leave it to you perhaps to make a motion that we do so appoint Mr. Given as CAO of the Jasper Community Housing Corporation, just if you think it is necessary at this stage.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ireland. I think it is necessary. I was aware of the need for this, but chose not to ask for it on short notice because my view is that we probably need to convene as the shareholders of the Jasper Community Housing Corporation to do so. It really is a little bit of a procedural specificity that I'm not sure is really that critical, but procedurally it probably actually is. It's the same people and the intent is the same. We could, and I would be in favor of suspending or even ending this meeting and reconvening as shareholders of the JCHC, simply to do that. On the other hand, to leave it until next week would not put us in a difficult position either. So it's a procedural matter primarily, and I leave it to you. I had intended to bring that forward before next week. We are not without a CAO in the interim. And there is no particular pressing procedural matter at the JCHC at this point that I have concerns with.
All right, well, I appreciate that. Mr. Given, I saw your hand up, so I will let you speak first.
Sure, Your Worship. I don't think there's any need for council to convene. Administration can be prepared for next week with a proper agenda as with council meeting as the shareholders of the corporation. And if Councillor Butler is confident that there's not a procedural reason to move sooner, then maybe my recommendation would be let's move more proper, and we'll come forward with a proper agenda that's set out in advance with appropriate notice for council, rather than having, sort of reconvening at the conclusion of this meeting as the shareholder.
Thank you for that. Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Given, and I agree with that. So I would also like, at that point, and my other reason for waiting until next week was I'd like to deliver a report on activities over the past couple of months, and I'm missing one piece of collateral to deliver that report and hoping to have it this week. So all of that is a reason to just plan to call a meeting of the shareholders next week. And then due notice is given. I'm not even sure what the provisions for due notice are in that regard. So let's go with next week, and then we'll be on this on the right side of it. Thank you.
Perfect. That's all fine, and we can deal with that in a week's time. Is there any other new business for council? If not, are there any councillor reports? Nobody wants to report that they visited Hawaii over the holidays? All right, upcoming events. Nothing, of course, scheduled in these COVID times, but we all look forward to an announcement, I presume in the next week or so, from the provincial government about status of the province and our region in particular, and whether or not we are still subject to the current regulatory regime. If there is nothing else, I think we are in a position at 10:47 to accept a motion to adjourn. Everybody was reluctant at first. Councillor Wilson, I will give that to you. So I have a motion that council adjourn at 11:48 now a.m. All in favor? There are none opposed. We are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone, for efficient use of our time this morning. See you all next week, if not sooner.
Point of clarification, Mr. Mayor. You said 11:48. It's actually 10:48.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, even better. You're right.
Exactly. Sorry.
Now,